30 days had passed since Ben-Hur departed from Antioch with Sheikh Ilderim into the heart of the desert. In that brief span, a significant transformation had taken place, especially in the path of his destiny. Valerius Gratus was no longer in power. Pontius Pilate had taken his place. Simonides had played a pivotal role in this transition. At a cost of 5 full talents in Roman currency, discreetly offered to Sejanus, the emperor's favored minister, the change was secured. Simonides had used the fortune he had won from Drusus and his companions, winnings now devoted to a sacred cause, lessening Ben-Hur's exposure while he moved through Jerusalem in search of his lost family. Interestingly, those who had lost the wager naturally became enemies of Messala, whose act of denial still remained unresolved in Rome. Although the transition was swift, the Jewish people quickly realized that the new ruler did not bring better times. When the new cohorts arrived to relieve the garrison at Antonia, they entered Jerusalem under cover of night. The next morning, the people awoke to a disturbing sight: military ensigns mounted along the walls of the old tower. These decorations bore imperial busts, along with eagles and globes, symbols that deeply offended Jewish sensibilities. In protest, a massive crowd marched all the way to Caesarea, where Pilate was then staying, and begged for the removal of the images. For 5 days and nights, they camped at his palace gates. At last, he summoned them to the circus for a meeting. Surrounded by soldiers, the protesters chose not to resist. They offered up their lives peacefully, and through their courage, they won. Pilate gave the order to remove the offensive symbols and return them to Caesarea, where Gratus had kept such emblems hidden throughout his 11-year rule. Even the worst of men, at times, perform acts that seem righteous. So was with Pilate. He commanded a full inspection of Judea's prisons, demanding a list of every person held in custody, along with the reasons for their imprisonment. His motive may have been fear of inherited responsibilities, a common concern for new officials. But the people saw hope in this act and found temporary comfort in it. The findings were startling. Many prisoners, against whom no formal charges existed, were set free. Others emerged who had long been thought dead. Even more astonishing, hidden dungeons were uncovered, cells so secret that not only had the public forgotten them, but even the prison officials themselves had lost track. One such instance took place in Jerusalem, and it is here that our story returns. The Tower of Antonia, an imposing structure occupying 2/3 of the sacred space atop Mount Moriah, had its origins as a Macedonian castle. Later, John Hyrcanus transformed it into a fortress to defend the temple. In his time, it was considered nearly unassailable. Yet when Herod assumed control, his grand vision led him to fortify and expand it further, creating a massive stronghold complete with offices, barracks, armories, cisterns, and, crucially, prisons of every classification. He carved into solid rock, digging deep excavations, and built atop them. A magnificent colonnade connected the tower to the temple, allowing one to gaze down into the sacred courts from above. Eventually, the fortress passed into Roman hands. Recognizing its strategic value, they adapted it for their own purposes. Under the rule of Gratus, it served as both a fortified garrison and a grim underground prison, feared by all who opposed Roman rule. When Roman cohorts surged forth from its gates to crush rebellion, terror followed. Yet, just as frightening was the quiet moment when a Jew entered through those same gates in chains. And with that understanding, our journey into the next chapter of this tale begins. The command from the new procurator to report on all individuals in custody had already reached the Tower of Antonia and had been swiftly acted upon. 2 days had passed since the last unfortunate prisoner had been summoned for inspection. Now, the final report, meticulously organized, rested on the table of the tribune in charge. Within 5 minutes, it would be on its way to Pilate, who was currently staying in the palace atop Mount Zion. The Tribune's office was both grand and comfortably cool, its furnishing befitting the stature of someone holding such a significant post. Around the 7th hour of the day, the Tribune appeared restless and visibly tired. He awaited the dispatch of the report so he could ascend to the colonnade's rooftop for a breath of fresh air and perhaps find distraction in observing the activities of the Jews in the temple courts below. His assistants, sharing the same anxiousness, were equally eager for the moment to pass. During that lull, a man entered through a side door, a heavy ring of keys in hand, each as weighty as a hammer. It was Jesus, the prison keeper. His appearance drew immediate attention, for his expression bore signs of unease and embarrassment. The Tribune, noticing, invited him forward. As Jesus approached, he admitted his hesitation in delivering troubling news. He recounted how, nearly 8 years earlier, Valerius Gratus had appointed him to oversee the prisoners. That appointment followed a violent riot during which an attempt had allegedly been made on Gratus's life. On that day, Gratus, bandaged from a fall, had handed Jesus the keys and entrusted him with 3 detailed maps of the prison structure. Each map depicted one level of the cells, and Jesus was instructed to familiarize himself thoroughly, inspecting every cell and attending to their security. Yet, before he could leave, Gratus asked for the map of the 3rd floor and pointed out a specific cell, number 5. That cell, Gratus had said, contained 3 men imprisoned for learning a dangerous state secret. For their offense, they were left blind and mute and condemned to spend the rest of their lives in darkness. They were to receive only food and drink through a wall slot. Gratus emphasized that the door to cell number 5 must never be opened by anyone for any reason. Even in death, the cell would serve as their tomb, for it was said to be leprous. Jesus had followed those instructions without question. To support his story, Jesus produced 3 aged parchments and spread one, marked as the lower floor, before the Tribune. But with a growing sense of conflict, Jesus then revealed a critical discrepancy. The original map showed only 5 cells on that level, but he had recently discovered there were actually 6. To illustrate, he sketched an updated diagram and handed it to the Tribune, who commended his effort and promised to have a new map made. Jesus, however, insisted he had more to share, something urgent that couldn't wait. He asked whether it had been his duty to believe Gratus regarding the details of the prisoners. The Tribune agreed. It had been. Jesus then revealed a shocking truth. Gratus had not been correct. While the keeper had dutifully ensured that food and water were passed daily for 3 prisoners through the wall, the cell had in fact housed only 1 man. Just the day before, Jesus had decided to see the occupants himself. The rusted door gave way under pressure. Inside, he found only a single figure, naked, blind, tongueless, and aged beyond recognition. His hair hung in thick mats past his waist, his skin dry and brittle, and his fingernails twisted like claws. When asked about his companions, the man shook his head in denial. They searched the room, but the floor and walls were clean and dry. Had 2 others died within, at least their bones would have remained. But there was nothing. Jesus concluded that only 1 man had been held in that dreadful cell for all those years. The Tribune warned him that he was essentially accusing Valerius Gratus of lying, to which Jesus humbly responded that perhaps it had been a mistake. The Tribune pushed back, stating that even by Jesus' own words, Gratus had been right. Food and water had been delivered for 3 men over 8 years. The implication hung heavy in the air. 2 days had passed since the last prisoner was examined at the Tower of Antonia. The report ordered by the new procurator was completed and ready for dispatch to Pilate at Mount Zion. In the commandant's spacious, cool office, the Tribune waited restlessly. Once the report was sent, he looked forward to some fresh air and light entertainment by watching the Jews in the temple courts. Just then, a man appeared in the doorway. Jesus, the prison keeper. His face bore a mix of alarm and guilt. The room fell silent as everyone waited for his words. Jesus spoke with hesitation, recalling how, 8 years earlier, he was appointed by Valerius Gratus and given keys and maps of all the prison cells. There were 3 maps: upper, middle, and lower floors. Gratus warned him never to open the door of cell number 5 on the lower floor. He said it housed 3 state prisoners, blind and tongueless, who were meant to die there in secrecy. Jesus was ordered to only feed them through a hole in the wall and never unlock the door. Now, years later, Jesus realized something was terribly wrong. The old map showed only 5 cells, but in truth, there were 6. To prove it, he sketched a new layout. Though the Tribune seemed ready to dismiss the matter, Jesus urged him to hear more. Jesus had recently opened the sealed cell for the first time. The locks were rusted shut, and the door crumbled. Inside, only one prisoner remained. Old, blind, tongueless, with wild, matted hair and bird-like nails. There were no traces of other prisoners. If there had been 3, the remains of the dead would have been there. But nothing, no bones, no evidence. The Tribune raised an eyebrow. Was Jesus accusing Gratus of lying? Jesus replied carefully, "It might have been a mistake." Just then, Jesus revealed more. After freeing the man, the prisoner returned the very next day, begging to go back to his cell. Something haunted him. Jesus agreed, and while they were inside, the man led him to a second hole in the wall. He cried out, and astonishingly, a faint reply came. A woman's voice. She said she and her daughter had been entombed there for years, begging for rescue. Jesus had shared food and water unknowingly through the man, who had secretly kept them alive. The Tribune finally saw the truth. The map had been a lie. The tale of 3 men was a cover-up. Gratus had concealed a crime. Moved by the revelation, the Tribune ordered the women's rescue and rushed with his men, instructing workers with tools to follow. Soon, they were gone, on their way to uncover what lay behind the sealed wall. The voice from behind the wall had confirmed what many might have guessed. A woman of Israel, entombed with her daughter. Those are the words. And at last, the truth emerged. It was Ben-Hur's mother and his sister, Tirzah. 8 years earlier, on the very morning they were taken, the 2 women had been secretly brought to the Tower of Antonia. Gratus, the Roman procurator, had made his decision to erase them quietly, far from public eyes. He selected cell 6 not by chance, but for its perfect obscurity and because it was tainted by leprosy, a place not just to hide them, but to let them slowly perish. That night, under the cover of darkness, slaves carried out the deed. No witnesses saw them. The women were lowered into the dungeon, and the doorway was sealed with stone and mortar. The slaves were then scattered and silenced, sent far away, never to return. This wasn't a hasty crime. It was carefully designed to mask murder beneath a cloak of Roman order. Gratus had a strategy. Rather than killing outright, he let time do the work. A slow, natural death, he thought, would offer him deniability if the truth ever surfaced. To sustain them just enough for suffering, he placed another prisoner, a convict already punished with blindness and silence, into the connecting cell. This man would pass food and water to them through a hole in the wall, but with no tongue and no sight, he could never reveal what he knew or whom he served. He was the final seal on the crime. Gratus's cruelty didn't end there. To ensure no trace of the women remained, he removed the former prison keeper, though the man knew nothing, simply because his knowledge of the underground might jeopardize the plan. Then, with twisted brilliance, he commissioned new prison maps. Cell 6 was removed entirely, and thus, both the cell and its doomed captives were erased from memory. To understand the true weight of what these women endured, one must go beyond stone walls and shadows. Misery is measured not by where you suffer, but by who suffers. These were not simple villagers. They were refined, educated, deeply spiritual souls. Their previous life had been one of peace, wisdom, and dignity. The mother of Ben-Hur had once sat in the sunlit garden of her palace, speaking with her son of heroes and nations, of faith and philosophy. She was once a noblewoman, a teacher, a mother filled with hope. And now, trapped in silence, darkness, and disease, her agony was far deeper than the eye could see. If you wish to understand her pain, don't count the stones around her. Recall the palace where she lived. Remember her voice, her dreams, her heart. For it is not the cold or hunger that breaks a soul, but the betrayal of the life that once was. And now, with this memory sharpened, let us descend into the darkness and face what has become of them. Cell 6 appeared just as Jesus had mapped it, its size hard to define, though clearly a large, rugged chamber. The walls and floor were uneven, jagged, and scarred by time and labor. Long ago, a deep, wedge-shaped crevice had separated the Macedonian castle from the temple. From the northern face of this fissure, workers began carving inward. They left the natural stone ceiling above, and one by one, they hollowed out cells. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1, all connected except for cell 6, which could only be reached through cell V. A similar technique had once been used to craft the tombs of the kings, just north of Jerusalem. Yet unlike those tombs, cell 6 was later sealed with enormous outer stones, thick and impenetrable. For ventilation, the builders had left small beveled slits, reminiscent of modern ship portholes. When Herod took command of the temple and the tower, he reinforced this wall with even heavier stone, closing all but one of those narrow openings. That single slit allowed just a thread of air and a feeble ray of light, far too faint to dispel the chamber's eternal gloom. This was cell 6. Now brace the heart. The horrific image of the blind and mute soul recently freed from cell 5 could offer only a faint prelude to what lay ahead. Near the aperture, 2 women sat huddled together. One rested on the stone, seated. The other leaned wearily against her. Between them and the hard rock, there was nothing, not a cloth, not a cushion. The upward-angled light struck their forms with an eerie glow, exposing them in their vulnerability. Yet even in that state, love endured, undeniable in the way they held each other. Wealth may flee, comfort may dissolve, and hope may wither, but love remains. And love, indeed, is divine. Beneath them, the stone had been worn smooth, polished by years of waiting. Who could say how many of those 8 long years had passed right there, beside that single beam of hesitant light? They had come to read the world through that crack. Dawn brought hope with its creeping glow. Dusk signaled another night, descending in suffocating silence. Through that slit, their minds wandered beyond prison walls, traveling, always searching. The mother looked for her son. The daughter searched for her brother. Across oceans, across distant lands, they imagined him wandering. Here today, elsewhere tomorrow. While they waited in stillness, he was out there searching for them. Their thoughts, his and theirs, seemed to cross paths again and again, like spirits passing silently in the dark. And so they comforted one another. As long as he lives, they would tell themselves, we are not forgotten. If he remembers, there is still hope. How powerful the smallest hope can be. Only those tested in such trials could ever understand. In remembering who they once were, one felt a deep reverence. Suffering had cloaked them in a sacred stillness. From across the cell, one could see that time had not merely passed. It had transformed them. The mother had once possessed the grace of a noble woman. The daughter, the innocence of a child. Now, even love struggled to recognize beauty in their forms. Their hair had grown long, wild, unnaturally white. The sight of them stirred a shiver, something that reached deeper than sympathy. Perhaps it was the sickly light casting strange shadows, or perhaps hunger and thirst had begun to take their toll. Since their servant, the condemned man, had been taken the day before, they had neither food nor water. Tirzah, leaning weakly against her mother's frail body, let out a soft, broken moan, and her mother, speaking with quiet strength, reassured her, not with loud certainty, but with faith that hadn't yet faded. She reminded Tirzah that God is good, that they had never failed to pray, with each trumpet sounding from the temple. The sunlight, though dim, still glowed. The hour was not too late. Help would come. They just needed to hold on and believe. The mother had spoken. Her words, though simple, carried weight. Tirzah, now 8 years older than when last seen at 13, had long since crossed the threshold of childhood. Yet in her pain, she reached for strength, wishing to endure for the sake of her mother and her long-lost brother. Her lips burned, her tongue scorched with thirst, and though she tried to be strong, the ache of separation from her brother haunted her spirit. Their voices echoed with a strange sharpness, harsh, metallic, and almost inhuman, a reflection of the long silence that had filled their days. In a tender moment, the mother drew her daughter close, sharing a dream that had come the night before. She had seen her son as clearly as she now saw Tirzah. In her vision, they stood in the women's court near the gate Beautiful, surrounded by many others. There, the figure she longed for appeared, searching the crowd. Her heart surged with hope as she called out and ran to him. But though he heard and saw her, he did not recognize her. And just like that, he was gone. The pain of change, the fear of being forgotten, settled deep within them. Yet, through all that sorrow, the mother held on to one belief. If ever they met again, they would find a way to be known. Suddenly, Tirzah's desperate cry for water broke the quiet. The mother, weary and helpless, looked around but found none. Her once strong prayers felt hollow now. Repetition dulled their power, and a shadow of doubt crept in. Death felt close, as though standing at the threshold, waiting for her final breath. Still, she forced herself to speak, to hold on. She whispered words of hope, assuring Tirzah that someone was coming, though her faith wavered with every syllable. Then, a faint sound near the small trapdoor stirred them both. The cry of a convict rang out, real and unmistakable. Hope surged. They stood up, holding tightly to each other. The voice that followed was unfamiliar, yet after 8 years of silence, it might as well have been an angel's call. It was the first voice the mother had heard besides Tirzah's in all that time. In a single instant, the shift from despair to salvation overwhelmed her. She called out, revealing their plight, a mother and daughter entombed alive, pleading for help. The response came swiftly, reassurance that help would return. Tears flowed freely. They had been found. A flood of hope washed over them. Home, family, life, all felt within reach again. They clung together, sobbing with joy, as the dim cell shimmered with the promise of a new day. Soon, the sound of heavy blows struck the wall. Iron tools worked methodically, echoing like salvation through stone. They did not speak, but listened, hearts racing, as freedom inched closer. Each crash of falling rock meant a step nearer to light, to air, to life. Just like miners buried in the depths, they heard the signals of rescue and stared, unblinking, toward the sound. They dared not look away, fearful it might cease. And then, a flash of red light pierced the darkness. Torches gleamed like diamonds, sharp and glorious. Tirzah's heart leapt with the innocent hope of youth, believing it to be her brother at last. But the mother, ever tempered by sorrow, bowed her head and gave thanks to God. The last barrier gave way. Dust-covered men stepped into the cell, their torches casting light on the unthinkable. They paused respectfully as the tribune entered, but the women withdrew, not out of fear, but shame. From their corner came the words that shattered all hope, not with anger nor fear, but with infinite sorrow. They declared themselves unclean. The words fell like stones, slow, trembling, devastating. A cry of the damned, a soul retreating from the gates of salvation, looking back one last time. And in that moment, the mother understood. The freedom she had long prayed for, long imagined as gold and glory, was a cruel illusion. They were lepers. She and Tirzah had become the very image of living death. In the law of their people, lepers were counted among the dead, cast out, untouchable, unblessed. Their very presence was an offense, their voices heard only to cry their own curse. They were to live among tombs, clothed in rags, forever separated from the world they once belonged to. And now, even in rescue, they were beyond reach, haunted not just by loss, but by the hopelessness of being alive and yet utterly forsaken. Time had become meaningless in the depths of their living tomb. Yet there was one moment the mother remembered clearly. She had once noticed a dry scurf forming in the palm of her right hand, a small thing, at first, which she tried to wash away, but it clung stubbornly. It meant little to her until Tirzah mentioned the same discomfort. With water in short supply, they denied themselves drink just to apply what little they had in hopes of healing. The condition worsened. The skin cracked. Fingernails loosened. The pain was dull but constant. Their lips grew parched and split. One day, in her continued effort to preserve dignity and cleanness, the mother brought Tirzah to a shaft of light, only to be struck with dread. The girl's eyebrows had turned white as snow. In that single glimpse, her worst fear came alive. For a long time, she sat frozen, wordless, her heart shattered under the silent scream of realization, leprosy. But when her mind turned to action, it was not for herself, but for her child. With quiet bravery, she buried the knowledge deep inside and chose to shield Tirzah from it. Hopeless for herself, she poured her will into comforting her daughter. She invented games, retold stories, and listened eagerly to songs, even as her own lips trembled with psalms meant to keep them both tethered to a God who now seemed so distant. The disease spread with slow cruelty, bleaching their hair, scarring their faces, weakening their joints, seizing their throats. Yet with each new symptom, the mother masked her pain with devotion, holding off the truth as long as she could. Inevitably, the day came when she could no longer hide it. Duty compelled her to name the affliction aloud. And so, in the grip of despair, the two prayed, not for healing, but for an end. Still, even that agony dulled with time. They began to speak of their condition with calm acceptance. Their bodies were slowly being destroyed, yet their spirits clung to life. What kept them going was one single thread: Ben-Hur. They spoke of him daily, convinced he had not forgotten them. The mother promised reunion to the daughter. The daughter, in turn, promised it to the mother. In those dreams, they found their reason to endure. It was just as they finished another 12 hours without food or water, still whispering hope, when the torches suddenly lit up the dungeon. Freedom had come, and though the past held only pain, the present mercy drew from the mother a grateful cry. God is good. The tribune arrived, and in the shadowed corner where she had hidden herself, a crushing sense of responsibility overtook her. She rose, and with agonizing courage, gave the ancient cry that had become a sentence. Unclean, unclean. In that moment, she accepted what freedom now meant. There could be no return to life as it once was. The house she called home would remain forever out of reach. If her son ever found her, she would have to keep her distance, and with love burning inside, still call out, "Unclean, unclean." Even the daughter she clung to now, her only companion in ruin, was a reminder of the life that could never be again. Yet still, she raised her voice in warning, as duty required. The tribune hesitated, shaken by her words. He asked who they were. The mother, unwavering, gave their story, not in bitterness, but in truth. Once, there had been a prince of Jerusalem, Ben-Hur, known to Caesar himself. She had been his wife, Tirzah, their child. She did not know why they were thrown into this prison, only that Valerius Gratus might have the answer. She offered him their suffering as proof. The Roman listened. He called for a torchbearer and wrote her words carefully. Her dignity, even now, stirred his pity. "You shall have relief," he promised, and ordered food and water to be brought. She begged also for clothing and water to cleanse themselves. He agreed. Her voice trembled with gratitude, blessing the Roman with a tearful prayer. But he added that he would not see them again. That very night, they would be released. He reminded her of the law and left. Soon after, slaves arrived. They brought water, bread, meat, garments, and a basin, then quickly departed. Later that night, the women were led through the gate and back into the city that once belonged to them. They were free, yet marked, under the same old stars above, shining as joyfully as before. They looked up and wondered, what now, and where would they go? Around the same time, Gesius, the keeper, reported to the tribune in the tower of Antonia. A lone traveler was making his way up the eastern slope of Mount Olivet. The road beneath his feet was rugged and dry, and the vegetation surrounding him bore the scorched colors of the Judean dry season. It was a blessing that he had both youth and strength on his side, along with the comfort of loose, flowing garments that eased his climb. He moved steadily, scanning both sides of the path, but it wasn't the uncertain glance of a man unsure of his direction. No, it was the gaze of someone returning to a familiar place after a long absence, a mix of joy and quiet curiosity, as if silently greeting an old friend. "I'm glad to be back. Let me see how time has changed you." As he climbed higher, he often paused to take in the expanding view behind him, stretching out all the way to the Moabite mountains. But as he neared the summit, his pace quickened. Fatigue no longer slowed him. He pressed forward eagerly, not looking back again. And then, near the top, where he veered slightly off the beaten path, he came to a full stop. It was as if something unseen had halted him. His eyes widened, his cheeks flushed, his breath quickened, all from a single sweeping glance at the sight before him. That traveler was Ben-Hur, and what he saw was Jerusalem. Not the Jerusalem of today, but the glorious city as it stood after Herod's reign, the holy city in the time of Christ. Even from old Olivet, it still held beauty. But how much more splendid must it have been back then? Ben-Hur sat down on a nearby stone. Removing the white head covering that shielded him from the sun, he took in the scene slowly, with reverence. Many have done the same since, under vastly different circumstances. The son of Vespasian, the crusader, the Islamic warrior, even pilgrims from distant lands centuries later. Yet among them all, none likely felt the stirring blend of pride, sorrow, and longing as deeply as Ben-Hur did in that moment. His heart was heavy with memories of his people, their triumphs and defeats, their divine history. Jerusalem stood as a monument to their greatness and their failings, their devoutness and their rebellion, their brilliance and their burdens. Though Rome had become familiar to him, it could not replace this. Pride welled up within him, but it was a pride tinged with pain. For all its splendor, Jerusalem no longer belonged to its own people. The temple worship now depended on foreign permission. The palace once ruled by David was now a place of marble deception, a seat where God's chosen were taxed and beaten merely for clinging to their faith. This was the common burden of every Jew at the time. But for Ben-Hur, there was more. His personal history was woven into the city's sorrow, and this view brought those memories flooding back. The landscape of hills had barely changed. Rocky ground is slow to forget. The scene he beheld was nearly identical to what one would see today, except for the city itself. Man's work had not endured. The sun had been kinder to Olivet's western slope. Life seemed to thrive more there. The vines held their green, and trees, mostly figs and aged olives, stood with some vitality. The greenery reached down into the dry bed of the Cedron. From there, Olivet ended and Moriah began. A stark white bluff, part of Solomon's foundation and finished by Herod. Ben-Hur's gaze climbed upward, stone by stone, up that massive wall. His eyes reached Solomon's porch, resting like a pedestal beneath the great hill. Then they moved further to the court of the Gentiles, then to the court of the Israelites, then to the women's court, and higher still to the court of the priests. Each level was a terrace of white marble, rising one above the other, and above them all, the crowning glory, majestic, luminous, sacred beyond measure, the tent, the tabernacle, the Holy of Holies. Though the ark no longer rested there, every Jewish heart believed that Jehovah remained. As a temple, as a monument, nothing man-made could match its grandeur. Now, not one stone remains atop another. Who will rebuild it? When will the new beginning come? Every pilgrim who stands where Ben-Hur once stood finds themselves asking that same question, knowing full well that only God holds the answer, and his silence is one of his greatest mysteries. Ben-Hur's eyes move beyond the temple, upward still, toward Mount Zion. That hill, tied forever to sacred memories and the kings anointed by God. He knew the cheesemonger's valley lay deep between Moriah and Zion, spanned by the Xistus, with gardens and palaces nestled below. But his mind soared beyond them. His thoughts reached the highest places of the royal hill, the house of Caiaphas, the central synagogue, the Roman Praetorium, the fortress of Hippicus, and the solemn monuments of Phasaelus and Mariam, all set against the distant purple hues of Mount Gareb. And there, in the midst of it all, he found his eyes resting on the palace of Herod. How could he not think of the promised king, the one he had pledged his life to, the one whose path he had chosen to prepare, whose empty hands he longed to fill? Ben-Hur imagined the day of his arrival. He saw in his mind the king claiming his city, Moriah and its temple, Zion and its towers, Antonia's fortress, the open city of Bezitha. He saw multitudes gathered, waving palm branches and singing with joy. The Lord had conquered. Israel had been given the world. They say dreams belong to sleep, but those who say so do not understand. Every goal we reach is born from a dream we dared to dream while wide awake. Dreaming is the balm of toil, the wine that drives us onward. We labor, not for the work itself, but for the vision it lets us chase. Life itself is a dream. Only in the grave does dreaming cease. So let no one mock Ben-Hur for dreaming. In that time, in that place, anyone else would have done the same. As the sun dipped low in the western sky, it hovered for a moment on the mountain's edge, lighting the city with a golden blaze. Then, in a sudden plunge, it vanished. The hush of twilight turned Ben-Hur's thoughts toward home. He fixed his eyes on a point in the sky, just north of the radiant face of the Holy of Holies. Directly beneath that spot, as the line would fall straight, lay his father's house, if it still stood. The soft tones of evening softened his heart. He let his ambitions fall away, remembering instead the duty that had brought him to Jerusalem. In the desert, while traveling with Ilderim and studying the land like a soldier mapping a future campaign, a messenger had arrived one night. The news was clear. Gratus had been removed. Pontius Pilate was to take his place. Messala believed Ben-Hur was dead. Gratus had no more power. There was no longer any reason to delay the search for his mother and sister. Now, there was nothing to fear. Even if he couldn't enter the prisons himself, he could find others who could. If they were found, Pilate would have no motive to keep them. At least, not one that couldn't be bought off. He would bring them to safety. Then, with his conscience clear and his duty fulfilled, he could fully dedicate himself to the coming king. That very night, he had spoken to Ilderim and received his blessing. 3 Arabs traveled with him to Jericho. There, he left them behind with the horses and continued on foot, alone. In Jerusalem, Malik would meet him. Ben-Hur's plan, it's worth noting, was still in its early stages. In light of what lay ahead, Ben-Hur knew he had to stay hidden from the authorities, especially the Romans. Malik was the perfect choice to help. Clever and loyal, just the right person to handle the delicate investigation. The first challenge was knowing where to begin. He had no definite direction, but his instinct pointed him toward the Tower of Antonia. Local tradition spoke of dark prison cells buried beneath that fortress. Even more than the soldiers stationed there, it was these dungeons that haunted the minds of the people. It seemed like the most logical place to begin, for that was the last direction he had seen his mother and sister taken. If they had ever been there, perhaps some trace remained, some clue that might lead to the truth. Yet underneath his practical thoughts, another hope stirred. Ben-Hur remembered that Umrah, the faithful Egyptian servant, was still alive. Simonides had told him so. On the day disaster struck, Umrah had escaped the Roman guards and run back into the house, locking herself inside. Over the years, Simonides made sure she had everything she needed, and so she remained, the only soul living in the once grand her residence. Despite Gratis' many attempts, the property was never sold. The story of its rightful owners kept it untouched. People passed it in silence, whispering of ghosts and shadows. Sometimes they claimed to see an old figure on the rooftop or peeking through a window, but the figure was not a spirit. It was Umrah, loyal, unmoving, alone. Ben-Hur believed she might hold memories, however faint, that could help him. At the very least, seeing her again, in the place tied so deeply to his past, would bring a measure of comfort. And so, he decided his first step would be to return to the old house and find Umrah. With that decision made, he rose shortly after sunset and began his quiet descent from Mount Olivet. Taking the road that bent slightly north of east, he made his way down. Near the dry bed of the Cedron stream, the path joined another, this one leading south toward the village of Salome and its pool. There, he met a herdsman taking his sheep to market. He greeted the man and fell in a step beside him. Together, they passed by the quiet garden of Gethsemane and entered the city through the ancient fish gate. It was already dark when Ben-Hur parted ways with the drover just inside the city gate. Turning into a narrow lane that led southward, he moved forward, unnoticed by most. A few passers-by offered him simple greetings. The pavement beneath his feet was uneven. The stones jutted out awkwardly. On either side, the houses were low, lifeless, and dim, each door tightly shut. Occasionally, from the rooftops, the soft murmur of women singing lullabies to children drifted down. The weight of his solitude, the cover of night, and the uncertainty behind his mission all pressed down on him. His spirit grew heavier with each step until he found himself at the edge of the deep reservoir, now known as the Pool of Bethesda. There, the still water mirrored the brooding sky above. Looking up, he caught sight of the northern wall of the Tower of Antonia, an imposing, dark mass rising against the dim, steel-gray heavens. He halted there, as if confronted by a silent sentinel. The tower loomed so high, so solid, and so unshakable, it demanded his reluctant respect. If his mother were buried alive within that monstrous place, what power did he have to help her? Strength alone meant nothing. Even an entire army, armed with rams and siege engines, could batter its walls and still be mocked by its defiance. To him, one man, the massive southeastern turret seemed to gaze down, still and indifferent, like a hill untouched by time. And in that moment, he felt the sharp sting of helplessness. Cunning could be foiled so easily. And God, always the last hope of the desperate, God could sometimes feel unbearably slow to answer. Uncertain and disheartened, he turned down the street that passed in front of the tower and continued westward at a slow, thoughtful pace. He knew of a khan in Bezitha where he intended to stay while in the city. Yet now, he couldn't resist the pull within him, the urge to go home. His heart drew him in that direction. Even the formal greetings he received from the few people he passed began to warm him, though faintly. Soon, the eastern sky began to glow with a soft silver light. Shadows slipped away, and from the western distance, once hidden shapes became visible, especially the tall towers on Mount Zion. They rose like visions, floating above the dark, gaping valley below, like ghostly castles in the air. At last, he arrived at his father's house. Some who read these words will understand, without explanation, what he felt. Those who once had joyful homes in their youth, no matter how long ago, places that now live in memory as the first chapter of their life story, paradises they left with tears in their eyes and would return to, if they could, like children again. Places filled with music, laughter, and love, more treasured than any achievement the future could offer. Ben-Hur stopped at the northern gate of the old home. In the corners, the ceiling wax still clung visibly. Across the doors, the board remained with its harsh proclamation. This is the property of the emperor. No one had entered or left through that gate since the painful day of separation. Should he knock like he used to? He knew it was pointless. Yet, the urge was too strong to resist. Perhaps Imra might hear. Perhaps she'd look out from one of the windows. He picked up a stone, climbed the wide stone step, and knocked 3 times. A dull echo answered. He knocked again, this time louder, waiting after each knock, ears straining for a response. The silence that followed felt cruel. He stepped back in the street and gazed up at the windows, but they remained lifeless. The rooftop's edge stood clearly defined against the lightening sky. Nothing moved. Had anything stirred, he would have seen it, but there was nothing. He moved on to the western side of the house, where 4 windows looked out. He watched them, long and hopefully, but again, to no avail. His heart swelled with frustrated longing. At times, he even doubted his senses, fearing that his own hopes were playing tricks on him. Still, there was no sign of Imra. Not even a flicker, not even a ghost. Moving with silent intent, he circled to the southern side of the house. There, too, the gate was sealed and marked. The soft glow of the August moon, rising gently over the crest of Olivet, known later as the Mount of Offense, cast a pale brilliance that made the letters on the board stand out clearly. He read them, and fury surged within him. In helpless frustration, he tore the board from its nails and flung it into the ditch nearby. Overcome, he sat on the stone step and whispered a prayer for the new king, hoping his arrival would be hastened. As the heat and weariness of long summer travel caught up with him, his rage cooled, and exhaustion settled over him like a weight. Gradually, he slid lower against the stone until sleep finally claimed him. Around that same time, 2 women came cautiously down the street from the direction of the Tower of Antonia, slowly approaching her residence. Their movements were stealthy, hesitant, and often interrupted by nervous pauses to listen. As they neared the rough corner of the palace, one gently confirmed their destination. Tirza, after looking up, clutched her mother's hand and leaned on her heavily, her body shaken by sobs, though she said nothing aloud. The mother urged her forward gently, trying to suppress the tremble in her voice, reminding her that mourning would bring forced exile. They would be cast beyond the city gate, never to return. The weight of those words broke Tirza's composure. She collapsed almost to the ground, sorrow overwhelming her. In a broken tone, she remembered the feeling of going home, then reminded herself with painful clarity. They were lepers now, They had no homes. They belonged to the dead. Tenderly lifting her daughter, the mother whispered reassurance, insisting they had nothing to fear. And, in truth, they moved with such emptiness that even a legion would have recoiled. Hugging the shadows close to the wall, they slid forward like specters until they reached the sealed gate. There, they stepped upon the same stone where Ben-Hur had stood just moments before and read the inscription left behind. "This is the property of the Emperor." The words struck the mother like a blade. She clasped her hands and turned her eyes upward, voicing a moan soaked in unspeakable grief. Tirza, alarmed, questioned her, and in a hushed reply, the mother revealed her torment. Their home, their last hope, was gone. Everything had been taken from her son, even this house. The revelation shattered any lingering hope. Tirza, unable to process the meaning of it all, repeated the word poor as if it were unfamiliar. But the truth was plain. He could never come to their aid again. The future, then, held no mercy. Tomorrow, they would sit by the roadside, begging like all others marked by their condition. If not begging, then something worse. Tirza leaned into her mother again and softly wished aloud for release through death. But the mother stood firm. Their fate was held by the Lord, and as believers, they would wait for him, even in this suffering. With that, she took Tirza's hand and led her swiftly to the west corner of the house. Seeing no one nearby, they kept moving, avoiding the bright light cast across the southern front and part of the street. Though the moon illuminated everything, the mothers will press forward. She glanced once toward the west-facing windows, then stepped into the light, drawing Tirza with her. And under that moonlight, their affliction could no longer be hidden. The marks were plain, on their cracked lips and blistered cheeks, in their clouded eyes and withered hands. Their hair fell in long, matted strands, stiff with decay, ghostly white like their eyebrows. It was impossible to tell them apart. Both seemed aged beyond time, their features twisted by disease into something almost witch-like. Suddenly, the mother froze and whispered a warning. Someone was lying on the step. They chose to avoid him, crossing the street quickly and continuing undercover until they stopped once more before the gate. The man remained completely still. Observing him carefully, the mother instructed Tirza to stay back as she approached the gate. But as she reached to touch it, the man stirred. A sigh escaped him. He shifted, revealing his face fully in the pale moonlight. She looked down, startled, then bent for a closer look. Her hands rose instinctively as her gaze lifted toward the heavens. Without speaking, she turned and rushed to Tirza, her voice tight with sacred awe. With trembling urgency, she revealed the truth. The man sleeping there was her son, Tirza's brother. At first, Tirza could hardly believe it, but her mother pulled her forward, urging her to look once more. They moved together, ghost-like, hand in hand. When their shadows touched him, they froze. His hand rested open on the step. Tirza dropped to her knees, wanting to embrace it, but the mother quickly pulled her back. Not even that. Her voice cracked in a whisper. They were unclean. She warned her daughter with desperate urgency. Tirza recoiled instinctively, shrinking away from him, her heart breaking under the cruel irony. He was her brother, yet untouchable, as if he were the leper instead. Ben-Hur rested there in his sleep, and even in stillness, he bore the grace and strength of a man shaped by hardship. His face, bronzed by the desert sun, carried the signs of endurance. Yet beneath the light mustache, his lips remained warm with color, and his white teeth contrasted sharply with the sun-darkened skin. A soft beard framed the full curve of his chin and throat. To the eyes of his mother, he was a vision, radiant and full of life. An ache rose in her heart, a yearning so fierce she longed to cradle him as she had in his childhood, to draw his head to her chest and cover him with the kisses of a mother's love. But something stronger held her back. something deeper than impulse. It was that sacred form of love that punishes itself for the sake of its beloved, denying comfort to preserve safety. She would have forfeited every hope, health, fortune, even life itself, rather than risk a single leprous touch upon his skin. And yet, she could not leave without showing her love. In that fleeting moment of rediscovery, she also had to renounce him forever. The weight of such a choice is known only to mothers. She knelt silently and crept to his feet. There, her lips brushed the sole of his sandal, dust-covered though it was. Again and again, she pressed her mouth to it, pouring into each kiss the full depth of her soul. The motion stirred him. His hand shifted, and he murmured in sleep, calling out to those he missed, his mother, his servant. Then silence returned, and his rest deepened. Tirza gazed at him, her eyes heavy with longing. Nearby, the mother dropped her face into the dust, suppressing a sob so heavy it seemed to tear through her heart. A small part of her wished he would wake, because even in dreams, he remembered her. That alone was enough. At length, she signaled to Tirza, and together they rose. With one final look, as if to seal his image in memory, they crossed the street once more. Hiding again in the shadow of the wall, they knelt there, watching him, waiting without knowing what for. Their patience was limitless, forged in the fires of love too deep for measurement. As time passed, and he still slept, another figure approached the corner of the palace. The two women in hiding saw her clearly. Small and stooped with age, she moved slowly, her dark skin weathered, her gray hair tucked neatly beneath a servant's scarf. A basket filled with vegetables hung from her arm. Upon seeing the man asleep on the step, she paused. Then, as if curiosity got the better of her, she moved closer. Her steps were light and cautious as she approached. Slipping quietly around him, she reached for the gate, sliding the latch open. A board on the left side swung inward without sound. She placed the basket through the opening and was about to follow, when something made her stop. Drawn by a strange pull, she turned to look down at the sleeping man. Her reaction was immediate. A soft cry, disbelief in her eyes. Rubbing them as if to clear away illusion, she bent closer. Her hands rose and trembled. She looked wildly around, then back to him. She lifted his hand from the ground and pressed a kiss to it, doing what those in the shadows could only dream of doing, yet dared not. The touch awakened him. Instinctively, he pulled his hand back, and as he looked up, their eyes met. Recognition bloomed between them. Though no words are needed to tell what passed, her heart spoke through her tears. She embraced him with all the joy of one who had waited too long. He returned the affection gently, his happiness only a shade less than hers. And though the hidden watchers could not hear every word, they saw the hunger in his eyes as he asked about his mother, about Tirza, pleading for news, desperate for connection. Yet all she could do was weep. He urged her again. Surely, she had seen them. Surely she knew. He begged for some sign they were at home, safe. Across the street, Tirza moved to rise, but her mother stopped her. With a whisper sharp as steel, she reminded her daughter they were unclean. That love, though aching, turned cruel in its protection. She would not let him share their fate, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, the woman at his side could only cry harder. He saw the gate ajar and asked if she had come to enter. Then, resolute, he rose to go with her. This house, he declared, still belonged to him despite the Romans. He cursed their lies and reclaimed his right. And just like that, they disappeared through the gate, he and the servant, leaving behind the two women hidden in the dust. The gate closed once more, silent and final. It would not open for them. Not now, not ever. The mother and daughter huddled there in the shadows, their hearts heavy yet resolute. They had done all they could. Their love had been tested and proven. By morning, they were discovered and cast out of the city, driven away with stones hurled in fury. Condemned, they heard the cruel verdict echo in their ears. "Begone, you are the dead, go to the dead." And so they went forth, carrying that sentence like a shroud. In the Holy Land, travelers searching for the famed King's Garden often trace their way through the Cedron Valley or the winding paths of Gin and Hinnom, arriving eventually at the ancient well of En-Rogel. There, they pause to sip its sweet, living waters and admire the heavy stones surrounding its rim, marveling at the simplicity of how the water is drawn. They offer fleeting pity to the ragged man tending the place, then turn northward, captivated by the rising slopes of Mount Moriah and Mount Zion, one descending into Ophel, the other into the site of the once proud city of David. In the distance, sacred landmarks glow in the sunlight. The elegant dome of the Haram, the resilient remains of Hippicus, still bold in ruin. With those sights impressed upon their minds, they cast their eyes to the Mount of Offense on their right and the Hill of Evil Counsel on their left. For those steeped in scripture and tradition, both rabbinic and monastic, these rugged places stir a fascination stronger than any fear. Beneath the Hill of Evil Counsel lies a place long feared, long cursed, Gehenna, the hell of brimstone and fire from ancient texts. There, carved into the hillside, tombs stare back from the bluff facing Jerusalem. For generations, this has been the dwelling of lepers, gathered not alone, but in community. Shunned as cursed by God, they built their own society, lived apart, and governed themselves in quiet suffering. 2 mornings after the events just passed, Umrah made her way to En-Rogel. A Jerusalem local might have guessed she served a prosperous household, given her composed bearing and a basket she carried, neatly covered with a white cloth. She placed the jar and basket beside her, loosened a shawl from her head, folded her hands quietly in her lap, and fixed her eyes on the steep slope above, where the hill fell into a seldoma in the potter's field. It was early, and she was the first to arrive. Soon, a man appeared with rope and leather bucket, greeting her as he prepared to draw water for a fee. When he asked if she needed her jar filled, she simply replied, "Not yet," and he moved on to other patrons as the dawn spread across the sky. She remained seated, eyes fixed on the hillside. Even as the sun rose above Olivet, she continued to wait in stillness. Her reason for being there was rooted deeply in devotion. Out of habit, she had always gone to market after nightfall, quietly slipping into the shadows of the city, making her way to the shops in the Tyropean or near the eastern fish gate. She would gather meats, vegetables, and return without attracting attention. Ben-Hur's return to the old home had brought her immense joy, yet she had nothing to offer him about his mother or Tirzah. When he urged her to move to a less isolated place, she refused. He offered to stay in his old room, but feared being discovered. Still, he promised to visit when he could, always coming and going under cover of darkness. Content in her quiet loyalty, she set herself to making him happy. In her eyes, he was still the boy she once served. She never questioned whether he had outgrown his childhood pleasures. Wanting to please him, she returned to her old habits. Remembering the confections he once loved, she set out one night earlier than usual, determined to find the best honey at the fish gate market. While searching, she overheard a man telling a story, one of the torchbearers from the Tower of Antonia, who had helped uncover prisoners in Cell 6. As she listened, she realized the tale was about the Hurs, the very family she served. Every detail was shared, including the widow's own account. Her heart overflowed with emotion. In a daze of joy and disbelief, she made her purchases and returned home, laughing and crying at once. She had found Ben-Hur's mother, but as quickly as hope bloomed, dread followed. How could she tell him there were lepers? She feared he would rush to the Hill of Evil Counsel, seeking them among the tombs, and in his desperation, expose himself to the disease. The thought tormented her. Driven by love and fear, she found a plan. The lepers, she knew, came to Enrogel at dawn to collect water, each leaving their jars to be filled from a distance. His mother and sister would be among them, for the law made no exceptions, no matter one's wealth or name. So she chose not to tell Ben-Hur of what she had learned. Instead, she would come alone to the well, waiting and watching. If they appeared, she would know, and perhaps they would recognize her too. Meanwhile, Ben-Hur visited often, speaking eagerly of plans. Malik would soon arrive, and the search would begin in earnest. He burned with urgency and filled his days by exploring sacred places. Umrah held the secret close, never speaking of it. When he left, she poured her soul into preparing his favorite dishes. And when the stars marked the end of night, she packed her basket, chose her jar, and slipped quietly through the fish gate, arriving at Enrogel just as the day began to stir. Shortly after sunrise, as the well buzzed with urgent activity and the water drawer worked hastily to meet the needs of the crowd, a new presence stirred. Half a dozen buckets swung at once, for everyone was eager to leave before the morning's cool air surrendered to the rising heat. And then, from the hill of evil counsel, its forlorn residents began to appear, figures emerging like shadows from the mouths of tombs. Gradually, they formed small, scattered groups. Among them were children so young that their very presence hinted at broken sacred bonds. Women balanced jars on weary shoulders, while the elderly crept forward with the help of staffs and crutches. Some leaned heavily on others, and the helpless lay bundled in litters like discarded cloth. And yet, within this community of suffering, love still flickered, tender and luminous, making their lives bearable, if not beautiful. From her place near the well, Umrah observed them with silent intensity. Though still, her heart stirred as now, and then she thought she saw those she sought. She believed with certainty that they were there, bound by law and fate to draw water, as all others must. Only after the crowd dispersed, she knew, would they come. At the foot of the bluff, one tomb stood apart, a gaping hollow marked by a large stone, exposed daily to the harshest sun. It seemed too desolate to shelter any living soul, save perhaps wild dogs wandering up from cursed Gehenna. Yet from this very tomb, two women emerged, one supporting the other, their movements slow and trembling. Both were white-haired, aged, but their clothes were whole, and their uncertain eyes roamed the grim scene as though it were unfamiliar. To Umrah, it seemed they recoiled from the misery surrounding them. Fragile signs, perhaps, but enough to send her heart racing. The two lingered by the stone, then cautiously approached the well. Alarmed voices rose, warning them back. The water drawer readied stones to drive them away. A chorus of curses followed, and from above, shrill cries rang out, those terrible, ritual words declaring their condition. Umrah, feeling a growing certainty, took her basket and jar and went toward them, though her heart trembled with doubt. Could these be the two she loved so deeply? As she neared, memories warred with reality. The elegant woman whose hand she once kissed, and the joyful, radiant child she had nursed. Could these aged figures truly be them? The shock overwhelmed her, and she turned away, telling herself she must be wrong. But then a voice called her name. It called again. Trembling, she turned and looked. Recognition shattered her doubt. Overcome, she knelt and wept. Her heart poured out in gratitude, her soul lifted in praise. But even in her joy, she was held back by warnings of their condition. The pain of separation pressed upon them once more, and a desperate exchange followed, silent to others, yet heavy with emotion. When Umrah offered food and water, her mistress insisted she keep her distance, fearing the consequences. She requested the basket be left behind, and the jar filled and returned. Those watching from the well, moved by Umrah's grief, stepped aside and helped her draw water. Questions arose, and she replied simply that these women had once shown her kindness. Lifting the jar, she hurried back, stopping just short of crossing the invisible boundary their illness had drawn. Gratefully, the elder accepted the provisions and, with a heavy heart, asked Amra for one final service. She revealed that she had seen Judah sleeping on the doorstep, but to approach him would mean his destruction. She begged Amra to say nothing of their presence, to spare him the pain, to protect him from the fate that had befallen them. Amra, torn and tearful, agreed. From that day, she would serve them in secret. She would bring what little they needed and carry back tidings of the one they loved, but never tell him they were alive. The sorrow of this promise weighed heavily on her, yet she understood his safety depended on her silence. That evening, Amra returned. From then on, she made it her quiet mission to tend to them at dawn and dusk. Though the tomb was barren and bleak, it offered something the tower never could: light, openness, and the nearness of the living world. Beneath the sky, where the sun touched their doorway and the wind carried whispers of life, they waited. And with each passing day, death seemed less like a sentence and more like a release gently approaching under heaven's watchful gaze. At dawn on the first day of the 7th month, Tishri by the Hebrew calendar, October in the Roman tongue, Ben-Hur rose from his bed in the Khan, burdened by a heavy dissatisfaction with the world around him. Since Malika's arrival, they had wasted no time. The man had gone straight to the tower of Antonia, boldly confronting the tribune in charge. There, he laid out the full history of the house of Hur, including every detail of the incident involving Gratis. He framed it not as a crime, but as a tragic misunderstanding. Their mission, he explained, was simple yet desperate. If any members of her family had survived, they would plead before Caesar for justice, seeking the return of their estate and their rights as Roman citizens. Malik expressed complete faith that such a petition would provoke a thorough imperial investigation, one the family's supporters did not fear. The tribune had answered with solemn detail. He confirmed the discovery of 2 women in the tower and even permitted them to read the memorandum taken from the women's testimony. Upon request, he allowed Malik to copy the document. Armed with this grim account, Malik rushed to Ben-Hur, but no words could capture the anguish the young man experienced upon hearing it. His grief ran so deep it left him motionless and pale, his heart aching without relief. He uttered only fragments, his lips barely moving, as the realization pierced him. His mother and sister were lepers. Again and again, the words fell from him like prayers twisted by sorrow, torn between unbearable pain and a rising thirst for justice. In one breath, he longed to find them before it was too late. In the next, his spirit burned with a righteous fury. Together, he and Malik set out toward the gate near the ancient lepers' quarter, opposite the Hill of Evil Counsel. Day after day, through the end of the 5th month, and all throughout the 6th, they searched. They handed out alms, asked after the women, and promised generous rewards to anyone who could bring news. Even the lepers, legally dead and driven by desperation, searched the dark corners of the city, haunted tombs, and hollowed wells. Yet all inquiries ended in silence. As the 7th month dawned, only one harrowing detail had emerged. 2 leprous women had recently been stoned from the fish gate. A painful alignment of dates and accounts left little doubt. They had been the ones. But beyond that, there was only darkness. No trace, no closure. Again and again, Ben-Hur repeated through clenched teeth that leprosy had not been cruel enough. Rome had also cast them out, driven them from the city they once called home. In his torment, he believed them both dead, lost to the wilderness, and he cried out to the God of his fathers, asking, "How long must Rome continue to rule, unpunished?" Anger, despair, and a thirst for vengeance burned within Ben-Hur as he stepped into the crowded court of the Khan. Overnight, the place had filled with travelers, but one group in particular caught his attention. These were young, robust men, clearly hardened by life outdoors. Their voices carried the tone of distant provinces, and their eyes held a mountain-born freedom not often seen in the lower classes of Jerusalem. They were Galileans, drawn to the city for the Feast of Trumpets. Instinctively, Ben-Hur saw potential in them, men who, with discipline, might rise to something greater. As he observed them, envisioning the strength of such men shaped by Roman rigor, a breathless messenger arrived, flushed and wide-eyed. News had broken of a conspiracy. Pilate intended to fund his new aqueduct using the temple's sacred treasury. The reaction was immediate and fiery. The men threw off their cloaks, bearing the simple tunics of laborers and herdsmen, ready to confront the affront. The protest, already in motion, was crossing the bridge. They would join it without hesitation. Ben-Hur, moved by both their passion and the possibility of alliance, asked to join them. They warned him of potential violence. He answered not with bravado, but resolve. Seeing his strength and poise, they welcomed him in. He quickly suggested unity, even leadership, an idea unfamiliar to them, but accepted in the moment. Together they departed, weaving through the rugged paths of Bezitha and around the Acre district. As they approached the Praetorium atop Mount Zion, the streets grew more congested with outraged citizens. The palace gates stood guarded, Roman soldiers unmoved by the heat or the crowd's fury. The elders had already gone inside, demanding to see Pilate, who had refused them an audience. A confrontation was brewing, one not just of voices, but of wills. Ben-Hur, silent but alert, sensed the deeper conflict, a question of power and justice. Inside, past marble walls and shaded courtyards forbidden to nature itself, they arrived at the square before the governor's residence. There, beneath a sealed portico lined with legionaries, the tension hung heavy. The people waited, the soldiers stood firm, and history held its breath. The crowd had grown so dense that even if Ben-Hur and his companions had wished to move forward, it would have been nearly impossible. So, they stayed at the rear, quietly observing the tents unfolding before them. In front of the portico, the tall turbans of the rabbis were visible, their impatience often spilling over into the mass behind. Cries rang out repeatedly, calling for the governor to appear, urging him to come forth. Suddenly, a man pushed his way out from the crowd, his face flushed with anger. His voice, raised above the murmurs, reflected frustration and humiliation, lamenting how little value Israel held in this place, how, on sacred ground, they were treated no better than the dogs of Rome. A few murmured questions followed, reflecting the rising tension. Would the governor appear at all? Hadn't he already refused several times? What actions would the rabbis take? Would they remain encamped until they were heard, just as they had done in Caesarea? A Galilean even wondered whether the Roman would dare lay hands on their sacred treasure, questioning if anything at all was safe from Roman defilement. Time dragged on. An hour passed with no answer from Pilate. Still, the rabbis and the crowd refused to leave. Noon arrived, bringing a light shower from the west, but nothing changed, except the crowd had swelled in number and in noise. Frustration turned to fury. The chants grew louder, more aggressive, with the same demand repeated again and again. Come forth. Ben-Hur kept his Galilean friends close. He understood the pride of a Roman, knew that eventually it would outweigh caution. The moment was coming. Pilate was likely waiting for the people to make a wrong move, something that would give him an excuse to respond with force. And then it happened. Suddenly, within the heart of the assembly, sounds of violence erupted, blows landing, followed instantly by cries of pain and outrage. Chaos surged through the crowd. The aged rabbis near the portico turned around, horrified. People from the back surged forward, while those in the center desperately tried to escape. The clash of opposing forces created a terrible pressure. 1,000 voices cried out in confusion. No one had answers. Panic set in. Ben-Hur remained calm. One of his Galilean companions admitted he couldn't see. Without hesitation, Ben-Hur lifted him up to get a better view. From that vantage, the truth became clear. Armed men, wielding clubs, were attacking the crowd. They appeared to be Jews, but it was only a disguise. They were Romans, beating the people mercilessly. Even the elderly and the rabbis were not spared. Ben-Hur brought the man down and turned to his companions. He recognized Pilate's trick, but he had a plan. The Galileans, fired up and ready, followed him quickly. They raced back toward the trees by the gate. Though Herod's planting was unlawful, it served a purpose now. Together, they tore large limbs from the trunks, arming themselves. Then, they returned. As they neared the square, they encountered the crowd, people rushing toward the gate in panic, shrieks and groans echoing behind. Ben-Hur shouted for his group to cling to the wall, letting the fleeing crowd pass. Inch by inch, they made their way into the square. With complete trust in Ben-Hur's lead, they formed a tight unit behind him and plunged into the chaos. When the disguised Romans met them, club to club, they were taken by surprise. The Galileans, swift and eager, met them head-on. Shouts of rage clashed with the crash of wood on wood. Fury and hate fueled their fight. Ben-Hur was the heart of it all. His training showed in every movement. He struck with purpose and precision. His long reach, flawless technique, and raw power gave him the edge. But beyond his strength, he seemed to be everywhere at once, guiding, protecting, striking. His voice ignited courage in his friends and fear in his foes. At first, the Romans resisted, but overwhelmed, they eventually turned and fled back toward the portico. The Galileans, wanting to chase, were held back by Ben-Hur's wisdom. He saw the Roman guard approaching, armed with swords and shields. A direct clash would be suicidal. They had done enough. Now it was time to withdraw. As they left, they stepped over the fallen, some still moving, some groaning, others silent forever. Yet not all the bodies were Jews. That, at least, offered a bitter comfort. The centurion yelled at them, but Ben-Hur laughed it off. With cutting sarcasm, he threw back words of defiance, mocking their Roman arrogance. The Galileans cheered, their spirits lifted. Outside the gate, the scene was even more overwhelming. People crowded every space, on rooftops, along the streets, and across the hillside. Cries of grief and angry prayers filled the air. Ben-Hur and his companions passed the outer guard unchallenged, but the centurion from earlier wasn't finished. Standing at the gate, he called out to Ben-Hur, challenging him directly. Ben-Hur answered calmly, identifying himself as a native son of Judah. The Roman challenged him to single combat. Ben-Hur responded with biting laughter, calling out the Roman bravado. But when offered arms, he accepted. The people fell silent, sensing something important was about to unfold. Ben-Hur had already bested a Roman in Antioch. Could he now do the same in Jerusalem? Without delay, he approached the centurion, took the offered sword and shield, and declined the helmet and armor. "They might not fit," he said. The soldiers stood silently, watching. The crowd buzzed with questions. Who is he? But no one knew. Ben-Hur was well-versed in Roman fighting methods. He knew their habits, the thrusts, the formations, the discipline. Just before the duel began, he warned the centurion that he had been trained as a lanista, a master of combat. The duel began. They faced each other, shields raised, eyes locked. The Roman made the first move, a feint. Ben-Hur saw through it. The next strike came at his face, but he dodged quickly, sliding his shield under the Roman's arm, catching both sword and limb. With one more step, Ben-Hur had the Roman exposed. A single strike, and the centurion crashed to the ground. Ben-Hur placed a foot on his back and raised his shield high, saluting the soldiers in gladiatorial fashion. The crowd erupted. Cheers echoed from rooftops to the farthest corners. The Galileans wanted to lift him in celebration, but he declined. To the officer who approached, Ben-Hur offered a final word of respect. The Roman had died with honor. He left his body untouched, keeping only the sword and shield. Turning to the Galileans, he praised their courage, but advised they separate to avoid pursuit. He asked them to meet again in Bethany, promising something important for Israel. When asked who he was, he simply replied, he was a son of Judah. The crowd pressed around him, eager to know more. He asked them to bring the sword and shield as a sign of allegiance. Then, without waiting, he pushed through the crowd and vanished. Later, under Pilate's orders, the people returned to collect their dead and wounded. Though there was mourning, it was tempered by pride. The unknown champion became a symbol of hope. Old stories of the Maccabees were told again. Even within the temple, there were whispers that Israel's time was near. Faith and patience, those were the words on everyone's lips. In this way, Ben-Hur claimed the hearts of Galilee. A small victory, but the path ahead was leading to something far greater. And what came next would change everything. And thus ends another chapter in the incredible journey of Ben-Hur. But this is not the end. A greater destiny awaits. New trials, deeper faith, and unexpected turns lie just ahead. So dear listener, stay with us. The next episode is coming very soon. Don't miss the next step in this epic tale of courage, betrayal, and redemption. Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a moment from Echoes of Stories. Until then, may the echoes of this story stay with you.